Today's lesson is on inverse trig functions or inverse circular functions. You've used inverse functions before when we had to untrig the ratio of a triangle in order to find the angle. We call these functions, for example, inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent. You'll also see them written as arcsine, so it could be written like that, or arc cosine, and they all pretty much mean the same thing. So if you have, as this first one shows, that y is the inverse sine of x, what that means is the sine of some number y is equal to x. So you're still untrigging whatever it is that you're doing. Also notice there are certain intervals that these can exist over, or quadrants of the unit circle that'll exist in. There are two different ones. The first is from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. We could also think of that as negative 90 degrees to positive 90 degrees. The other one is 0 to pi, or we could say 0 degrees to 180 degrees. And they are all like this. So how do you know which is which? Well, if you think about the fact that the sine really on a coordinate is the y value, and the cosine is x. So sine covers, this is your unit circle, sine covers this part. Cosine covers this part. So when you're dealing with secant and cosecant, secant is the inverse of cosine, and cosecant is the inverse of sine. So secant is going to be the same quadrants as cosine, and inverse cosecant will be the same quadrants as inverse sine. Regarding tangent and cotangent, if you remember the fact that tangent is y over x, and cotangent is x over y, tangent will cover those same y values like sine, and inverse cotangent will cover the same x values like cosine. Now, a lot of these questions are going to ask you to solve without a calculator. So to get started, it says that y is the arc cosine of 3/2. What that means is the sine of some number that we don't know is going to equal to square root of 3 over 2. Well, remember that when you're looking at the coordinates, sine is going to be the y coordinate, and arc sine will exist here. So I just have to find a y coordinate that is square root of 3 over 2. And when I look at that, I see here it is. So that's going to give me pi over 3 radians. On the next one, it's written differently, inverse sine rather than arc sine, but it means the exact same thing. The sine of what is equal to negative 1/2. So I just have to find a y value somewhere that's equal to negative 1/2. It's right here, so it will be 11 pi over 6. The problem is I don't get to use 11 pi over 6. My value needs to be in between negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. So 11 pi over 6, if I look at it backwards, it's really negative pi over 6. Remember, they're the same thing, but 11 pi over 6 goes all the way to here, whereas negative pi over 6 goes there. The last one, the inverse sine of square root of 2. So the sine of what is equal to the square root of 2. As I start looking around the unit circle, what I should realize is that this does not exist. Taking a look at the next one, the arc cosine of 0. Remember that cosine is the x-coordinate. So the cosine of what will equal 0? And again, remember that cosine is going to be the top half of the unit circle. So I start looking for where my x value is 0, and I find that it occurs here at pi over 2. The inverse cosine of 1/2. The cosine of what is equal to positive 1/2? So I start looking for an x-coordinate that's positive 1/2, and that's here at pi over 3. The difference on these two, there are two differences. The first thing is that it's not asking about a y, but a theta. That theta tells us that we need to be looking for degrees. The other thing that's different is now that we're looking for inverse tangent, inverse cosecant, it's not just going to be an x or y value. We're actually going to have to do something. So we'll need to remember that tangent is sine over cosine, or we can just say y over x. And that cosecant, nope, not cosine, cosecant, is really 1 over y. So I'm looking for a tangent value. So the tangent of some angle is going to equal square root of 3, or I could say that's got to equal y over x. Now because y is in the numerator, and y is sine, I'm going to be using this part of the unit circle. So start looking for y over x's that equal square root of 3. Well, it could be here or here. I'm going to say that it's not going to be these two because these have some negatives in them. So it'll be one of those. I'll start with the top one, square root of 3 over 2 over 1/2. So if I copy dot flop, there's my copy dot flop. And amazingly, that worked the first time. So my first angle right here is 60 degrees. If I look for the inverse cosecant of negative square root of 2, so cosecant is 1 over y. Again, because I'm dealing with y, it's going to be quadrants 1 and 4. It's got to be negative. So I'm looking for a negative y value, which means it'll really be down in quadrant 4. And I need it to be square root of 2. What I can see here is that square root of 2 only occurs right there. So if I need the inverse of that, what I'm looking at is negative 2 over the square root of 2. But remember, we need to rationalize denominators. So if I multiply that by square root of 2 over square root of 2, I get negative 2 square root of 2 over 2. These cancel, and I'm left with negative square root of 2. So this angle here is 315 degrees. But remember, I'm only allowed to go from negative 90 to positive 90, which means that instead of rotating a positive 315 degrees this way, I really am going to rotate a negative 45 degrees. So the answer here is negative 45 degrees. Notice that the last two problems do not tell you that you have to solve without a calculator. So you need to write down the keystrokes that you're going to need in order to solve these problems. First, we're going to look at this one. because it's y, I need to make sure my calculator is in radian mode. Then what I'm going to do, because if you remember your calculator does not have a secant button, I'm going to enter the inverse cosine of -1/4. So I'm taking the reciprocal trig function and I'm taking the reciprocal here. When I do that, I find that y is equal to approximately 1.823. For the next problem, I need to put my calculator in degrees. So to calculate this, what I'll put into my calculator is the inverse tangent of negative 1 over 0.2528. And what I get is negative 75.813. The problem is I've got inverse cotangent. Because inverse cotangent has to be between 0 and 180 degrees, my answer's in the wrong quadrant. So what I then have to do is I need to add 180 degrees. And when I do that, the answer I get is 104.187 degrees.